Hi, and welcome. In these initial lectures, we'll be talking about what the Gospels are and how to read them. And I have a lot of different things to say about this, and you've done some reading on this already. And so we'll have quite a few lectures where we talk about these things. Now, I've been teaching NT1 for quite a few years now, and as a result of that teaching for many years, I eventually wrote a book that I know you've already been reading, and Reading the Gospels Wisely. And there's an old saying for professors, write a text, ruin a course. And what that means is that you develop all these lectures over the years, and then eventually you write them down in a book because you want to get it clear in your mind and you want students to be able to read it beyond your own class. And maybe you want, as I've done, I wanted my own students to be able to read this material as well, and maybe my most careful version of it. And so I've done that, but then the problem is when you go to lecture on that same material, then you've already got it in a book form, and the question is what to talk about in the actual lectures. Now it turns out, of course, that by the time you've written a book, and if you're a scholar who's still involved in writing and reading, the result is you have a lot more things to say. And so I certainly do, and the material keeps growing each year. Nonetheless, I do think that what I've put into this book is foundational for how I approach the Gospels. And so what I want to do is, I'm assuming you've already read the chapters we'll be talking about as we go through the lectures, but what I want to do in this time, and we'll have other opportunities to discuss this in other formats, but what I want to do is just kind of walk through the points of the chapters as we go through and use as an introduction to talk about some additional material as well. The point is, though, that the main things I want to say in these initial quite a few lectures are the things that are in the book already, and so that'll be the basis of what we're mostly talking about. In this chapter 1 of what are the Gospels and defining gospel, as you recall, and you can look back through the book, what I do is I go through the idea of what the gospel is, and that is particularly what that word means and where it comes from. And my main argument is that the word gospel is something that the Apostle Paul and the other apostles use, but that they get it from a very specific place in the Jewish scriptures. And my argument is that the primary place they get it is from what is called the fifth gospel in the early church, that is the book of Isaiah. And of course it's called that because the book of Isaiah is so important and so clearly for Christians after they came to understand who Jesus was and what he was about, and after years of reflection on this and the giving of the Spirit after Pentecost that enabled them to reread scriptures the Jewish scriptures in a Luke 24 kind of way. After all that happened, they saw Isaiah as one of the most important books that helped them so clearly see what God was doing through Jesus Christ. So that's why it becomes the fifth gospel. And particularly that word in its verbal form and occasionally in its noun form became crucial for the apostolic witness. And so I discuss in the book how that goes from being an oral proclamation to being something that's attached to actually writings. That probably happened first with Mark, where he calls his book the Ta Euangelion of Christ. He calls it the gospel. And then Matthew and Luke and John seem to follow suit in that. And eventually you get this one book called the Ta Tetrauangelion, the gospel book, and then it's according to these four different authors. And so then I talk about what gospel means, what that word means, and how it works out in each of the synoptic gospels particularly. And then I offer a provisional definition that you'll find in the book there as well, of saying that building especially on the Isaianic vision, the New Testament authors define gospel as Jesus effecting, that is bringing into effect, the long-awaited return of God himself, bringing back his people from exile and into the true promised land of a new creation, forgiving their sins and fulfilling all the promises of God and the hopes of his people. The point is that I'm already defining gospel in a way that I think Isaiah is defining it, and I think the gospel writers and the Apostle Paul and the other apostles thought of, and that is it's about the story of God. It's about the redemptive story that God is bringing about his kingdom. And I think once you understand that, the point of this chapter is it makes a lot more sense of what's going on in the Gospels. Now in the second chapter of the book then, what I do is I go on a little bit more specifically to talk about the genre of the Gospels, meaning what type of literature are they as opposed to other types of literature. And I talk about the idea of a genre overall, and then I argue that, along with many, many scholars today, that the Gospels look and smell most like Greek biographies or Greek bioi, which are not exactly like our biographies, but have a lot of similarities as well. And in fact, is a widespread genre in the Greco-Roman world at this time. And so I talk about them being bioi and some of the benefits of understanding them that way. And then I also talk about them as being bioi plus, like more than just biographies like the Greco-Roman world, and give a sort of more comprehensive understanding. And you can see all that in the book. And one of the most important things to highlight there is that of course, the claims that the canonical Gospels are making about Jesus are so much more than just that he's a great teacher, he's a great philosopher. That certainly is true. And I think it's very important to recognize that Jesus is presented as a philosopher or is presented as a prophet. He's presented all those ways and one to model your life on. We'll get to that here in a little bit. But at the same time, they're making claims that are more than that he's God incarnate, that God with us is manifested in who Jesus is. So, and another part of it is that the Gospels are part of a bigger story, the canonical story and the story of Israel. So I think it's really helpful to recognize the Gospels as genre biographies, but also to recognize they're doing something more than that, and that gets us a long ways. And so then I explore some aspects of the Gospels as biographies, as well as some of the implications, and you can see all those in the book. The biggest one I always like to highlight, because I think that we need to understand this because it's not as common for us as evangelicals, and that is that the Gospels provide Jesus as a model to follow. And there's a lot of sense in which that's a no-brainer, because Christians have always understood that to be a Christian is to be a disciple, it's to be a follower. And how do you learn to be a follower? You see the person that you're supposed to follow. You don't just believe doctrines. You don't just understand things correctly. You don't just do moral things. You don't just have a certain worldview with the right view and the right answer on certain moral issues. To be a Christian is so much more than that. It's to be a disciple. And this is one of the main reasons why the Gospels are so important, and one of the things they provide for us is they provide Jesus as this model. Now I realize that, again, part of the reason we as evangelicals have not talked that way as much is because that can kind of sound scary to us. That can sound like somehow that's diminishing Jesus' divinity, but of course it's not. In the same way that the gospel genre is biography, but it's more than that, so too we can embrace that the Gospels give us Jesus as a model without in any way diminishing the fact that they're also making these claims about his authority and his divine incarnational nature. And so those are all things that I think are really important as we think about the Gospels in those first two chapters. And so then I give a fuller definition after that discussion, and that is this, that our canonical Gospels are the theological, historical, and aretological, which is a word I made up to mean virtue-forming, biographical narratives that retell the story and proclaim the significance of Jesus Christ, who's the restorer of God's reign. One little note, and then one bigger note on that. First of all, that word aretological, I'm kind of bummed that I chose that word and made up that word, because there was actually another word that I knew that I'd forgotten during the writing of this book, and it comes from Ellen Cherry's excellent work on similar issues. And the word I wish I would have used is aretogenic, which more literally means virtue forming, but the idea is still there. So I call it aretological. You can think of it aretogenic as well, virtue forming. And that leads to the bigger point I want to make on this definition, and that's that these three descriptors of the Gospels are all very important, that they're theological, they're historical, and they're virtue forming. And throughout the rest of this class, what I'm going to be doing is try to unpack both at the theory level and then in walking through each of the four Gospels, unpacking how it is and modeling really for you how to read the Gospels in a way that reads them in all three of those ways. Historical is what we're usually used to, but I want to encourage us not only to read them historically, but read them theologically, which includes a kind of literary reading, and also read them for the purpose of our own formation to help us become disciples. So that's the big idea, and that's a great way, I think, for us to start and lay the groundwork for what we're going to be doing in this class.